signed up for this talk at a time when the elections in our country are still sort of entertaining people. And, this is a time.
Oh, I don't know if I can compete with that.
People are also. This is sort of midterm and so on. So the small audience is no reflection on the warmth we feel for our colleagues over in the University of Windsor and for the security and fastness of the collaboration between our two centers. Dr. Weir has got his degrees in classics from the University of British Columbia in 1990, and he got an MA and PhD from Princeton in classical archaeology. And since 2002, he has been a professor in the classical studies program of the University of Windsor's Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. We have a department similar to that here, but it's a little longer in its designation. His teaching interests range widely in the Greco-Roman world, though his favorite course is the University of Windsor's Archaeological Practicum in Greece that combines a comprehensive tour of the country with a couple of weeks digging up the remains of the ancient city of Helike. In fact, there's a little plug here for that course. If there are students here, please consider it because they're going to offer it in July, August 2013. And WSU students are welcome to enroll and get transfer credits. His research and publications are in the area of Greek archaeology, mainly Greek numismatics, that is having to do with coins. Though he has a long-standing interest in both backyard astronomy and old books. In fact, we have in our audience people who are interested in the history of the book, and they will be talking to Professor Weir after this presentation. When he's not teaching course in archaeology and ancient Greek languages or Greek civilization or Greek history, Dr. Weir likes to relax to the music of George Dalaras.
I can play some if you want. I'll do that later.
And he likes to read antique books, and also he likes to use his fancy telescope to look into the starry night. So we have a well-rounded scholar who has journeyed across the border and braved the weather to come to speak to us. So even though we are small in number, please give him a warm welcome to the podium with applause.
Would it be possible to dim the lights, at least the ones at the front here, just to make the screen a bit easier to see? And since we are small in number, feel free to move down. Move forward, friend, as it says in the Bible. There's plenty of room at this feast. I'm interested in archaeology. I'll do a bit of detective work today. I'm interested in old books and astronomy. You'll hear a bit about that as well in today's topic. But really, when it comes to today's topic, I'm a dilettante. I really don't have a professional knowledge about that which I am speaking. And so hopefully you won't ask too many hard questions. If you do, I also hope you won't ask for your money back. So, a journey in time and space, that sounded like a good hook. I hope to explain what I mean by that. What I'm going to be talking about today is pretty cool. It's a detective story. I don't have the final answer yet. I don't have conclusive proof, I think. But I think I may well have a worm. I'm referring to a famous quote in book collecting circles. In nature, the bird who gets up earliest catches the most worms. But in book collecting, the prizes fall to birds who know worms when they see them. Part of what I'm about to talk about today is a lucky find that may well be something very interesting. So, where does the story begin? It begins on Ottawa Street in Windsor, which is that little town just across the river, at my favorite store there, a place called Juniper Books. According to a newspaper account that appeared about a year and a half ago, a feature piece on the bookstore, this is the story behind the book I will be discussing today. The proprietor of the store is the one telling the story here. An old man came in right when we opened in 2006. He looked like he was 100 years old and just got off a ship. I love that. I can just see it. He had a flowing beard and came in with this old book from 1599. It's a science book from someone who actually predated Galileo and was very important. That's the end of the proprietor's story. In doing a bit of preparation for this piece, I spoke to him again about the circumstances of this book coming into his store. And he told me that the old man actually brought 3 books in, one of which was signed by John Cowan, a local resident from the 19th century. And he presumes all 3 books came from the collection of John Cowan. In any case, the gentleman had found the book in the historic McGregor-Cowan House in Old Sandwich Town, the oldest part of Windsor, when it still stood vacant. Looking around the inside of the empty building, the gentleman had come across stacks of dusty and very old books in the back, and, intrigued by the volumes, he tracked down the building's owner and picked up the books. 30 or 40 years later, that gentleman walked into Juniper with the old books in tow. So that was in 2006. At that point, the proprietor of the store bought one of the 3 books, the book I'll be talking about today, and kept it in his own private collection until last year, October 2011. At that point, he decided he might as well sell it. It was Latin to him. Well, it was in Latin, which was Greek to him, and he could use the cash. So he put it on sale, and it was bought by a private collector about 6 weeks later. And I first started working on this book and its annotations in February of this year. So everything I'm going to tell you is, you could say, a rush job, and I'm hoping to sound plausible. So the book by Benedetti looks like this. It's a book about so big, that tall, this wide, what they call a folio, a rather large format book, bound in limp vellum, which is goat or sheepskin, a sort of parchment really. And there you see the title page, which is typical of the period for being very effusive in its titulature, I guess. The Book of Speculation, Speculationum Research Project of John the Baptist Benedictus, or Benedetti, a Venetian patrician and most outstanding philosopher. This book, in which there are treated the following discussions with marvelous subtlety, keenness of mind, and there's a list of them right there. So it's an omnibus sort of book. It's his life work. It's about 425 pages in length, and deals with a number of mathematical topics, but also engineering, astronomy, astrology, music theory, and other subjects besides. So it's quite an unusual tome. Let me give you a sense of what it looks like on the inside. But first of all, what I first noticed about it as I was handling it was that the binding, that limp vellum binding, is of the period, is of the late 16th century, because bound into the cover, you can see it where the paper is torn away, old black letter printer's waste, broadside or portions of a book cannibalized by the binder and incorporated into the binding. So it is in the original binding, it seems. This may well be some sort of a legal text of the 16th century that's reused. So this book inside, as I say, is quite a treasury. It's all in Latin, but there are well over 100 diagrams there. A lot of them of a mathematical or geometrical nature, but also there's, as I said, work on music theory. It's Benedetti who first proposed an objective basis for musical beauty, for instance. That sounds that sound pleasing to our ears sound pleasing precisely because the chords involved are in certain, or the notes involved are in certain mathematical proportions to each other. So that's what he's discussing here. Here's another page where he discusses and illustrates a miraculous self-oiling lamp that he produced for some duke or other. A lamp that keeps itself supplied with oil no matter what. could your job be next? Another interesting couple of pages is what they call a volvel. These are meant to be cut out. These are two different sides of the same sheet of paper. Sorry, my battery's dying on the pointer. Two different sides. And this is opposite this, and that is opposite that. And you're meant to cut out the two discs and mount them one on top of the other and hold them in place with a pin so you can rotate them. It's essentially a 16th century computer. It figures out for you the rising and setting of the moon. One side, the rising of the moon. Then if you turn it over and move this dial over to the second side and pin it down on this side, you can get the setting of the moon worked out for the latitude of Turin. Why Turin in northwest Italy? Because that's where the book was first published back in 1585. The edition that I'm talking about today was put out in Venice in 1599, but to anticipate something I'll mention again later, it's the same book exactly. It's the same stack of pages. There was only one print run. It didn't all sell in Turin back in 1585, and some enterprising businessman carried the pages that didn't sell over to Venice, and they were flogged twice again, in 1586 and 1599, with different title pages. But the rest is identical. So the same stack of papers, the same print run. And this brings me to printing. Printing in those days, that is to say up until about 1800, was quite primitive. It's what's called the hand press period. Type would have to be selected from boxes, a different letter in each box or a symbol in each box. You mount the type into what's called a copy stick. You build it up line by line. You lock the copy sticks into a metal frame called a form, along with any wood cuts or other engravings you might have. Those also get locked into the form. And then you simply put it through the press. You have a fellow here inking the form with those padded ink pads. Another fellow getting a bit of folio paper ready. This will be folded down over that, and then this whole thing hinged and folded over there to make the impression. In other words, very labor intensive. Two men working a hand press could do, it is estimated, about 240 impressions an hour. So about 4 a minute. What else have I found out? Well, in the period in which we're talking, that is the first 150 years or so of printing, Venice had a large, prospering book production market. Close to half of all the printed books known from that period were produced in Venice. And I also found out, doing a bit of research, that in this period, print runs were very small. Books were expensive to buy. If you think they're costly now, they were very expensive in those days. And a big investment, too, considering how labor-intensive it is to set up a production. Once you had printed off a page, you might have to then disassemble the form and reuse the type for other pages. A printer didn't necessarily have very many individual type bits. And so really, once your print run is done, that's the end of that book. You can't do it again, not exactly the same. The minimum print run I found for that period was between about 250 and 300 copies to make costs back. But no print runs really, with a couple of very few exceptions, no print runs really went above 1,000 copies. So we're talking several hundred copies maybe of a book available. And as I mentioned before, the Benedetti, the collected works of Giovanni Battista Benedetti, appeared 3 times at 3 different title pages in 1585, 86, and 99, but it was all the product of one print run back in Turin. We know this because the page breaks are exactly in the same places for all 3 years' editions, if you will. So this will be an important point later on. So what do we know about the author? If you're anything like me, I knew nothing about this guy a year ago. Now perhaps I ought to have heard of him because he's one of those underappreciated geniuses of the Italian Renaissance, I think. But Giovanni Battista Benedetti, as his title page says, was a patrician of elite nobility from Venice, presumably of independent means, and we know very little about his biography except that he was clearly very bright. He ceased formal education at about age 7, but then went on with a private tutor to specialize in mathematics over the years. And at age 22 or so, he produced his first book, I Envy Him, and of course books will always be in Latin at that point in time, his Resolutio, And as my note says, it deals with problems from Euclid, the Greek geometer. And he proposed a new theory of falling bodies, how bodies fall, and what speed they fall if you drop them. Unequal bodies, he said, of the same material fall at the same speed in the same medium. In other words, he's refuting Aristotle. Aristotle had said, well, it's common sense. Heavier stuff will fall faster than lighter stuff. A 10-pound cannonball will fall faster than a 1-pound cannonball. And so Benedetti is saying, no, that is not the case. And this is a conclusion that Galileo belatedly reached, but not until 1590 in a work called De Motu, Concerning Motion. Galileo had an earlier theory of motion that was more Aristotelian, and seemed to have revised his notion late in the century. And I'll come back to revisit this kind of thing, this influence between the two men later on. A couple of years later, at age 24, Benedetti produced yet another book, the Demonstratio. He works again on this theory of falling bodies, and he nuances his earlier theory slightly, saying that what can be a mitigating factor is surface area of a body. This perhaps can slow a body down if a body has a lot of surface area, but volume itself is not a factor. In any case, my point is, he's doing what is, for the time, very advanced work in physics. And he got some sort of a paying job, but it seems from about age 30 on, he was court astrologer and mathematician to a couple of Italian notables, first the Duke of Parma, and then for the last 23 years or so of his life, the Duke of Savoy in Turin, in northwest Italy. So he's a man who produced a number of works which are in this Speculationum Liber, his life's work put out towards the end of his life. But how much did he influence his contemporaries? What I give you here, and I hope you can see it, and if you can't, I'll read it, is a synopsis of his contribution to the field from the Dictionary of Scientific Biography. I should add that I have consulted some real books in preparing for this presentation. I know that's unfashionable, but this particular extract does admittedly come from a website. So, what does the dictionary say? Benedetti's scientific originality and versatility leave little doubt that his work afforded a basis for the overthrow of Aristotelian physics. The extent of its actual influence on others, however, presents very difficult questions. The case of Galileo is most perplexing. It is widely held that he was directly indebted to Benedetti for the ideas underlying De Motu, his treatise on motion, 1590. But the resemblances of those ideas are easily accounted for by the Archimedean principle and the medieval impetus theory, easily accessible to both men independently. I don't want to get into this, but there is some validity to that point. While the differences between the two men, particularly in respect to acceleration and accumulation of impressed motion, are hard to explain if the young Galileo had the work of Benedetti before him. And I think that's a good point. If Galileo knew about this guy, there's no evidence of it before the 1590s. The absence of Benedetti's name in Galileo's books and notes, where other kindred spirits such as Guido Baldo del Monte are praised, is suggestive. Of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially if you're plagiarizing somebody. But I'm jumping too far ahead. Much more so is the fact that Benedetti is not mentioned to or by Galileo in the vast surviving correspondence of his time. Jacopo Mazzoni has been proposed as a positive link. He was a colleague and friend of Galileo's at Pisa about 1590, and certainly knew of Benedetti's work by 1597. But since Galileo left Pisa for Padua in 1592, the connection is uncertain. Benedetti appears to have remained unknown to Galileo's teacher at Pisa, Francesco Buonamico, who in 1591 published a treatise De Motu, over 1,000 pages. Imagine that, 1,000 pages on falling bodies. Ooh, that must have been a bestseller. On the whole, it appears that Benedetti's Speculationum was not widely read by his contemporaries, not widely read, despite its outstanding achievements in extending the horizons of mathematics, physics, and astronomy beyond their peripatetic boundaries. So in other words, bright fellow, he just didn't have a good PR doctor putting his name out there, if people were slow in hearing of him, if they heard of him at all. And that's perhaps why we didn't hear about him. So this is a book that has had a very sort of glib, very meager Nachleben, sorry, pretentious German word, afterlife. People haven't heard of it. I did a world catalog census, again, relying on the internet, and I turned up 45 copies of this book throughout the world. 26 of the 1585 edition, just one of the 1586 edition, and 18 of the 1599 edition. I'm not interested so much in the numbers as the proportions. About 40% of the books are from the 1599 edition. So it looks like no more than half of the books sold when the book was first published. A good chunk of the print run was taken to Venice. So the Speculationum Liber is not only rare and never circulated widely, but I found out it's never been translated from Latin in its entirety. Thus, both its contents and Benedetti's work generally are largely unknown today. I was trying to track down various copies, and this slide shows a copy I found in a stately home in England, owned by the famous classicist Richard Bentley. He was not interested in mathematics at all, as far as we know. His work is on Greek, correcting Greek texts, but he was one of the few owners whom I could find. Anyway, the upshot of this rarity is that one, I think, could plagiarize Benedetti with impunity. In fact, I know of one example of this. A French mathematician by the name of Jean Tenier, back in 1562, wrote something called the Demonstratio, which plagiarized Benedetti mercilessly, but nobody noticed the plagiarism for almost 200 years. Nobody noticed for 200 years. This gives you a sense of how well known or unknown Benedetti was. So I'll come back to Benedetti later. Bit more of the backstory now. The book I'm talking about supposedly came from the McGregor-Cowan House. This is what it looks like today. It is a bakery in Old Sandwich Town. And if indeed this was the property of John Cowan in the 19th century, he was an eminent Windsorite of the mid-19th century. He is notable, first and foremost, for being the founder of the first newspaper in that part of Ontario, in that part of Canada. Something called the Canadian Emigrant, which he published in this house from 1831 on. And John Cowan died around 1867, as far as I can determine. So, as one looks inside the book, one gets some interesting clues. Here is what is pasted inside the front cover. It is clearly an extract from some book dealer's list, whether at sale or at auction. And it describes the book, but I'm interested in what it says down at the bottom here. 2 small pieces cut from the title page, and then this notation, 18 shillings. I'll get to the cuts later. But 18 shillings is a price that would have been typical for a book of this sort, an old book, around the middle of the 19th century, in the middle decades of the 19th century. In other words, by the middle decades of the 19th century, there is this damage that is noted here. 2 small pieces cut from the title page. So that, of course, made me look at the title page again, and I saw something that I had missed the first time through. And here I show it to you with a bit of blue paper behind, so you can actually see it. On the title page, there are indeed 2 cuts, with bits of letter forms protruding beyond the edges of each cut. Very curious. This cut's slightly smaller, 10 by 20 millimeters. This cut's slightly longer. But since I know a bit about old books, and I was wondering, well, why do this? Why mutilate a book like this? If it's a previous owner, why not just cross out the name? That's the usual MO. And besides, why disfigure? Why vandalize what would have been a rare and precious book at any period? And if you're wanting to assert your own ownership of this book, why not then put your name there? There is no other signature. There is no other owner's name anywhere in the book at all. So it's a curious thing. And so naturally, I decided to see what kind of hay I could make from those protruding bits of letter above and below the cuts. And I looked in alphabets, scripts of the period, and there are really only 2 possibilities for something that loops up like that or like that. C's and G's. C's and G's. So the name of the owner is, his initials are CC or GG or maybe CG or GC. So, you know, potentially it's owned by Charlie Chaplin, and he's older than we think. But I don't think so. I'm thinking about who would be the target audience for a very specialized book on mathematics, astronomy, and other mechanical subjects like falling bodies and things like that in around 1600 in Venice or thereabouts. And I think you know where I'm heading with this. I'm wondering if this could belong to somebody whom you may have heard of, Galileo Galilei. Certainly more of a household name than Giovanni Battista Benedetti. And he did sign his books on occasion, though not always. If you go to the Museo Galileo website in Florence, you will find nicely digitized every book that they have that he owned. And lots of books he didn't own, but he would have owned copies of. Some of them he has signed his name, for instance here or there. And so we know he did do that from time to time. Now the evidence I'm going to present, I don't think is watertight. I don't think it's conclusive or a smoking gun, as they say. But I think it is suggestive. I'm going to be looking at paleographical evidence, the evidence of letter forms. I'll be looking at circumstantial evidence, and perhaps most convincingly at the end, the transfer of ideas. Because it seems to me that reading this book, that the things Benedetti says are things that Galileo then, if not verbatim, quotes. So these are ideas he picks up and either develops further or refutes or just appropriates for his own. And so it seems to me that if this is not his book, he certainly did know about Benedetti's work. And that is something that no Galileo scholar has ever been able to decide one way or the other. So Galileo's signature, as I say, there are plenty of examples in books, and you can find a lot of these online, as I did. Certainly the word Galileo tends to be about the same size as the cutout, slightly bigger. And the Galilei tends to be a little longer, because he likes to do a little flourish with his eye at the end there, and about the same height, though slightly shorter often. So the cutouts are about the right size for what we know of his signatures, but how do the traces match up? Well, here's the left signature, or the left part, and again, this is another one of the things that makes me wonder if I'm really on the right trail or not. Why is his name, if that's his name, why is it separated into two bits? You know, I don't sign my name, Robert, 6 inches of space, Weir. You know, why do it that way? I don't know. Anyway, what I've done here is, here's the cutout in the book, and here I've put over each of these signatures a similarly sized cutout, just so you see what might or might not have been shown in this sort of a case. And if you superimpose one of those signatures, you get this. That big loopy trace here corresponds nicely to what might be a G, and this is all scaled to the same scale, of course. I have a little trace there on the paper that could be the top of an L. But I don't know how to explain this dash here, though sometimes his G's were flamboyant enough to have a stroke that went quite some way. But still, as I say, it's not entirely watertight. How about the other side? Well, here's what's preserved in the book. And could this be the squiggle of an eye, something like that? I don't know, maybe. If I do the same exercise, the results are a bit less felicitous, admittedly. So it could be, as you might say, that I'm on the wrong trail here, or it could just be the thing was angled differently. But just for the sake of comparison, there it is. However, there is an interesting statistical argument you can make. I've been checking with a number of paleographers here in the States and in Europe, saying, you know, could this be GG? One person demurred, and she said, no, I think it's Richard Bentley's copy, but then I found Richard Bentley's copy was safe and sound in Chatsworth House, England, so never mind that. But nobody has said it isn't G and G. And so, if that is the best fit for the traces, we'll put that on the back burner for a moment. And if you're willing to believe the word of an expert, a woman by the name of Isabella Trucci, who works on Galileo manuscripts in Florence, that this is indeed, these annotations throughout the book are in an Italian hand of the early 1600s, then something interesting comes into play. A couple of months ago, I went and got a really nice, thick biography of Galileo out of the Windsor Library by Heilbronn, and turned to the back where there was a glossary of some 285 names of people, and I discounted Galileo, so it was actually more than 300 names with Galileo's friends and relatives in there as well. But I looked at a list of 285 names from Italy around 1600 of friends, acquaintances, disciples, enemies, colleagues of Galileo, just to get a sense of what people were called in Italy in those days and what their names were like. So, About 19% had a first name beginning with G. About 7% had a second name beginning with G. And my cutouts are about the same size, roughly speaking, or at least the traces within them are. And so I said, well, how many people have names that are about the same length? Plus or minus, let's say 15%, because some letters are bigger than other letters. Okay, about 35%. Now none of that is terribly impressive by itself until you consider that whoever signed this book would have to fulfill all three criteria at once. And so if you multiply those fractions together, you get the fact that only about 1 in 200 people in Italy in that time would have fulfilled all three criteria. And if you consider that maybe there were only 400 copies of Benedetti's book available in 1599 in Florence, that kind of narrows the pool. So, that's statistics for what they're worth. I'm always thinking of Mark Twain when I talk about statistics. There are 3 types of mendacity, Mark Twain said. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. So, I'm sure having had an election, you got statistics out the wazoo. So I won't bore you anymore. But it is curious that the name is cut out. And I think, why on earth would that be there? And one possibility occurred to me. It's well known to people who study Roman art. It's called damnatio memoriae, obliteration of memory, or what they used to do in the old Soviet Union. Remove somebody's name, knock down their statues, that sort of thing. A very public excision from the record. And we know this was the case for Galileo too. For instance, the correspondence he carried on with his eldest daughter, we have her replies back to him, wonderfully published in a book called Galileo's Daughter, of all things. But his letters to her were destroyed when she died in 1634. And then we have this book, the Difesa, where Galileo jealously defends his invention, an invention of his that I'll mention later, against an imitator who stole the idea from him and made a lot of money off it. So Galileo produced this rather testy rant of some 40 pages. It exists in maybe a dozen copies in the world. This one, in St. Andrews University, Scotland, is interesting because it's signed by the author down here, dedicated to a fellow called Angelo Contarini, l'autore, by the author. And there's a strange discoloration around it. And the person who published this, a professor at St. Andrews University, concluded that that had been pasted over. But what you see there is a trace of glue. So the St. Andrews Difesa, here's another view of it. There's a handwritten note by the person who brought it to Scotland back in the 19th century. And this note reads, "This defense was written by Galileo himself. The copy is therefore a presentation copy to one of the Contarini family, Venetian nobles who were his patrons. The writing is Galileo's autograph." And here comes an interesting bit. "As I verified in the public library at Venice from Galileo's manuscript with the aid of a polite librarian, which ascertained the point beyond a doubt." In other words, one could easily walk around Venice in the mid-19th century, go to the library, and see the originals. There must have been a number of originals floating around. And this, of course, might remind you of the fact that I said that that bookseller's catalog in the copy I'm talking about has a price that relates to about the middle of the 19th century. This particular book was bought from a bookseller in Venice called Canciani. He hadn't noticed the inscription. Boo-hoo, poor him. But this happened in 1845. And as I say in my note here on the screen, the Windsor Benedetti apparently appeared for sale, probably in London. That was the center of the English language book trade in those days, in the mid-1800s, to judge from the price. So could it be that some cache of material suddenly was made publicly available at that point in time? But this also brings up the possibility of damnatio memoriae, obliteration of memory. Maybe that's why the page, if you will, was vandalized and no subsequent owner's signature put there. So if you're going to invoke the name of this GG guy, you better be ready to have some good evidence, I guess. He is well known. He is, for the scientific revolution, a saint of sorts. He has been beatified, you could say. There are even relics of his. If you go to Florence, in the Museum of Science, there's his finger. I've heard some people referring to that as the middle finger that he's holding up to the church to this very day. And you know, you have all sorts of stirring moments from art and popular lore about Galileo standing up against the church and all that sort of thing. That's the later Galileo, however. The one I'm going to be talking about is the younger fellow who is still trying to make his way in the world. Because if you look at his life, we know that at the time when this book would have appeared in Venice, Galileo was the professor of mathematics at nearby Padua. I've never been to Venice or Padua, and so I'm here relying on the internet, but according to Google Maps, Venice and Padua are about 30 kilometers apart. And we know from his diaries he often visited Venice, if only to father 3 children on a local ex-courtesan by the name of Marina Gamba. Anyway, it was a productive period in his life. He was breaking into teaching professionally. I can tell you a bit about his teaching load in those days, in case you're curious. He had to labor under as many as 10 students per course, and teach a good 3 courses a year, I'm sorry to say. We even know some of the things he taught from year to year. Typically mathematical stuff, as you would expect from a professor of mathematics. Euclidean geometry was a regular recurrence, but also some advanced astronomy. And these are subjects that are treated in Benedetti's work. We also know that he made a bit of extra money on the side by teaching perspective to budding artists so they could represent buildings and whatnot in proper perspective, and astrology to medical students, because how can you be a good doctor unless you can cast your patient's horoscope, right? I mean, I'm sure all doctors here can do that too, right? They can cast your horoscope, so you need math for that, obviously. He produced a number of publications, or 2 big ones, in his years at Padua, a book on mechanics, and his ticket to fame, The Starry Messenger, the Sidereus Nuncius of 1610. That's what moved him into the really big time in Florence for the rest of his life. He also invented stuff, something called the geometrical military compass, essentially a slide rule is what it is, a mechanical slide rule. And although he didn't invent the telescope, he certainly adapted it and popularized it, made it sound like he'd invented it, much as, Al Gore invented the internet. And his name is forever linked with the telescope, though it's not actually his invention. So these were years when he was gearing up. He was in his 40s, late 30s, early 40s, while at Padua. As I say, astrology is one of his big numbers, and what I always find lovely, and this is sort of an aside here, is this page from the autographed manuscript of the Sidereus Nuncius, again available, as you can see from the Museo Galileo website. One of his lovely renditions of the moon as seen through the telescope here, but then publications about Galileo never reproduced the bottom half of this picture, which is the horoscope for his hoped-for would-be patron, Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, as a way of buttering him up, you see. He was hoping that Cosimo would take him on with a sinecure job in Florence. So he was an astrologer. Anyway, so much for the circumstantial evidence. What about the writing itself? The writing that's really there as opposed to not there. Well, on the title page, this is something I noticed just 2 nights ago, Sunday night. There is something that is quite different in style from a lot of what else is in the book. Right here, where in the table of contents it lists the work on perspective, perspectivae, somebody has written page 119. And indeed, that is the first page of that work. And we do know that Galileo did do the teaching in perspective to make extra money. But I'm interested in the style of the handwriting too, because he has a very distinctive sort of P, with a forward flaring tail, if you like, and he always forms a loop of his P from the top down. Loop of the P from the top down. And I show you a few examples from, I've just taken more or less at random from the first page of the autographed manuscript of the Sidereus Nuncius. And you can see very similar looking P's there. Other marginalia deal with a lot of the mathematical questions and are in, I think now, a second hand, a different handwriting perhaps. This was suggested to me by one of my correspondents, and I think that person is correct. For instance, here near one of the mathematical theorems, somebody has noted, this question is solved through fractions. 4/5, 2/3 are in relation to 5/6, and in the box here, let 2/3 be divided by 4/5 and 5/6 results. So that's pretty banal. This is somewhat less banal, perhaps, page 13. Proposition. That which is contained under two equal sides, under two sides, is equal to the square root that is contained under the squares of these same things, or something like that. Obviously, if one's writing notes to oneself, they're not meant to be interpretable 400 years later to total strangers, but it's something along those lines. He's giving a paraphrase for an easier way to do this problem. Or on page 274, another one of the more extensive marginalia. Once the contents have been given, and then I can't understand this last word. I've been baffled by this for months. Something, the reason of the sides defined, the proportion of the sides defined. Maybe it's easy, or it is possible, or something like that. I'm just not entirely sure what that word is, and nobody I've consulted seems to know either. Perhaps it's some idiosyncratic abbreviation. Anyway, what one can do, again, thanks to the internet these days, is go online and find plenty of Galileo's autographed manuscripts online. For instance, Manuscript 72 in Florence, which is a notebook of about 150 pages, worked on by Galileo, and I highlight his textual contributions, but also a couple of his disciples or fellow researchers, Arrighetti and Guiducci. And so for a while, I was comparing what I had in the book that I'm working with what was in Manuscript 72. For instance, that prop there, proposition. This is what appears in the Benedetti book, and this is how Galileo would write it. Somewhat similar. But as I said, this could be a second hand. Or in venire. Here I'm comparing the Windsor book with Galileo, with his disciple Guiducci, with Arrighetti. The treatment of the E, for instance, is different here, E with a long tail. And if one looks carefully, one can flesh out various differences and similarities. Or dato, written as, the D is written as two strokes, descending from the top down, looping around like that, and then an arc over there, top down, looping like that, an arc over there, whereas Arrighetti and Guiducci seem to do it in a single stroke without lifting the pen from the page, or the quill, I should say. And perhaps most intriguing is this abbreviation, which stands for rationem, the reason in the accusative case. Galileo frequently abbreviated that Latin word ratio, which means reason or logic. Here's his ablative singular abbreviation, but his collaborators always wrote it out in full. So that too is curious. I also noticed as I was working with this that handwriting could change with context. Obviously, if you're in a hurry versus if you're writing something formal or nice for presentation. And so you can see also from the internet the autographed manuscript of his Sidereus Nuncius, his starry messenger that really made his name. Here's his working draft, his first draft there, the first few lines of the treatise. And here's exactly the same passage in his second and final draft. This guy didn't waste time with drafts. That he sent off to the printer. Much tidier looking. Some of the letters are more carefully refined. The P's have their proper tails there. And the reason I'm talking about this is that I think that context matters. If you're scribbling a note to yourself in a notebook, you might be a bit more sloppy if you're the only one who's likely to read that. If, however, you're writing something in a book, you might want to be a little neater, or something for presentation. You want to be a bit neater and more careful. So I think context matters. And so, over the last couple of months, I've been working on looking at marginalia by Galileo in books that we know he owned, to see what his letter writing style is like there. Here's one example, for instance. Here's Galileo's personal copy of Copernicus, a revolutionary work of the 16th century, censured by the Church. But in 1620, the Vatican gave permission for good Catholics to read this book, provided they made 20 corrections or excisions to it. And you can see what Galileo's done here. He's circled, if you will, the problematic bits of text, and ever so lightly crossed them out, or written the approved text in the margin there, but in such a way that the original text is still perfectly legible. So observing the letter of the law, but totally violating the spirit of it, I guess. And so he's a good Catholic, and yet preserving Copernicus' knowledge as well. What I think is perhaps most persuasive in connecting the Windsor Benedetti with Galileo is, as I said, the borrowings. We've got circumstantial evidence We've got paleographical evidence that I have experts in Italy working on for me. They very kindly agreed to help me out by looking at these things and trying to find out who could have written it if it wasn't the big man himself. But the third sort of evidence, I think, is perhaps the most persuasive. Over the years, a number of scholars have wondered if there was a connection between the two men. For instance, here's a recent book, 2010, by a fellow called Valeriani. And on pages 169, 170, Valeriani discusses connects Benedetti's discussions of how our thermometer would explain the vapor you see coming out of your mouth on cold days, with both Galileo's own thoughts on the subject in circa 1615 and Galileo's development of a thermometer. So in other words, Benedetti says one thing, Galileo riffs on it, expands on it, invents a thermometer. So lots of people have pointed out bits and pieces like that. What I have found that is perhaps a little more suggestive is that a number of passages, several pages in the Windsor Benedetti are in fact contain underlined portions. And I hope you can see the underline there. It's that same reddish-brown ink that was on the title page, saying page 119, which I think may be a different hand possibly from the rest of the annotations. These underlinings connect the passages in Benedetti that I can find quite easily in Galileo's works. Not verbatim, but certainly the borrowing of ideas is there, I think. For instance, on this particular page, Galileo is adopting some of Benedetti's arguments against Aristotle's interpretation of the moon's spots. Aristotle has said the moon is a perfect sphere. Spots are just blemishes really on the surface, like tarnish on silver. No, says Benedetti, it's something else. And Galileo riffs on this in the Sidereus Nuncius of 1610 and confirms Benedetti's hypothesis with his own telescopic observations. And together, the two of them demolish the Aristotelian fallacy that the moon was a smooth, perfect sphere. Or another example that I found, you can see here a little bit of underlining here. This was Benedetti talking about why it is that stars seem to twinkle, whereas planets don't. In the Sidereus Nuncius, Galileo uses this passage from Benedetti's book when explaining that the newly discovered stelluli, little stars, revolving around Jupiter that he saw with his telescope, these little things here, the four Galilean moons as they're called, why it is that they do not twinkle and thus are not stars, and thus must be closer to us than the stars are. That they're really somehow involved with the planets and not with the stars at all. Nor are they phenomena produced by the Earth's atmosphere. So here he is taking an idea, and here the actual key phrase is actually underlined. That is quite suggestive. And here's another borrowing. I mean, there are several. I won't bore you with them, but there are quite a few. Here's something else. One of those famous diagrams from Benedetti's book is the diagram that accompanies a discussion of a supernova that appeared back in 1572. And Benedetti was called to give a lecture on it. And Benedetti said this supernova is not some atmospheric phenomenon. It's not gas igniting in the upper atmosphere or a weather balloon or something like that. No, this is something in the sphere of the stars itself. How do I know that? Well, simple geometry, friends. Parallax. If you get observers from different points on the Earth, say Turin versus Venice versus Athens or anywhere else, have them measure the angles at certain times and triangulate, you'll realize that this phenomenon has to be way out there. It's not here, a few thousand feet above our heads. It has to be way out there among the fixed stars. Anyway, that's what Benedetti did back in the 16th century. In 1629, Galileo's Dialogo revisits the supernova and parallax issue because he was called upon to give a lecture about another supernova that had appeared in the early 1600s. And he essentially repeats Benedetti's argument, and in his Dialogo, the book where he talks about this again in 1629, he even repeats this diagram. I guess if it's a good diagram, why not? And so both men, of course, accomplished the same goal by placing these supernovae, the exploding stars, among the stars and not somewhere in the Earth's atmosphere. That proves that the cosmos is not changeless. It's not as it was created, and thus challenges the church's view. So these are some of the sort of highlights. There are some other borrowings too that I've been able to trace. And it's very curious. The other night I was looking at the Sidereus Nuncius in more detail, reading the Latin. And I was struck by the fact that Galileo quite blatantly borrows other stuff from Benedetti. For instance, when discussing why it is that the moon turns a sort of deep coppery color during a lunar eclipse. That is, when the moon falls into the Earth's shadow. Benedetti says, quite correctly as it turns out, this is caused by the fact that the sun is behind the Earth from the moon's point of view, and the sun's light refracts through the Earth's atmosphere. That's where a sunset. So essentially, the moon is red because a sunset is being projected onto it through the Earth's atmosphere. And Galileo, in Sidereus Nuncius, picks up this idea, and he says, yes, but, you know, I think that the moon has an atmosphere. And so that's why it's red. So he likes the sunset idea, but it's not so much the sun's rays being refracted to the Earth's atmosphere as the sun's rays being refracted to the moon's atmosphere. But to me it suggests he knew this argument. Or for instance, how does Earth shine exist? That is to say, when you see a crescent moon, if you look at it carefully, often you'll see the dark part of the moon is partially illuminated until it becomes half full, what we call first quarter, or conversely as it's shrinking, last quarter. So in that first week, on either side of a new moon, you can see the dark part of the moon partially illuminated. It's called Earth shine, which is indeed its true cause. We know this is sunlight reflected off the Earth's surface. And Benedetti proposes this as the reason, but he says that some people suggest that it could be, you know, Venus, for instance, Venus reflecting off the moon's surface. Venus is very bright. Galileo repeats Benedetti's argument and then goes on to ridicule the Venus hypothesis, by saying angles don't work out. You know, Venus isn't always in the right angles to create those illuminations when they happen. So it's all very interesting, and I think it's all connected. There must have been a very small sphere of people who cared about such things in Italy in the early 1600s. And I think if one looks more closely than I have already, one will find more borrowings. And so I'll close with this example. This is a mock-up in a museum of this thing that Galileo invented in 1604, what he called his geometrical and military compass, essentially an early slide rule that could perform calculations by you move the arms together and where this curve intersects. I don't understand it all, but apparently it was effective. Galileo had quite a racket going here. He would sell this for a goodly sum to students, and then he would sell the lessons on how to use it. And in his Difesa, he takes he really takes a guy called Baldassare Capra to task, because Capra plagiarized Galileo's instruction manual, essentially, and offered his own rival set of lectures cheaper. So I find that rich. Partly it shows how nicely these people were, if you will, sharing ideas. We call it plagiarism. Maybe they didn't see it that way. Clearly Galileo was offended, but if you actually look into the history of this device, this mechanical slide rule, you'll find that the idea is not purely Galileo's own. He got the idea from other people, much as he got the idea of the telescope from the Dutch. There are plenty of other inventors in Italy, I just list them there for what it's worth, who had similar things in mind and would hypothesize similar devices. So really I think what we have is a very fertile time and place, and this book, the Windsor Benedetti, and in the long trip it's made from Turin, Italy, a stack of printed sheets from 1585 to Windsor today, this book is part of that very rich scientific dialogue. Thank you for your patience.
You can swallow the water. Sorry to come in late, but how much do you know about the provenance of this book?
It was for sale in a Windsor bookstore last year. The bookseller had it in his own private collection for 6 years. Before that, it came from what's called the McGregor-Cowan House, a house built in 1810 in Windsor. It seems to have been there since the middle of the 19th century, I think.
But before that, you don't have records?
No, no.
Too bad.
So yeah, it first appears in Windsor's McGregor-Cowan House, mid-19th century. Stays there until about 1970. An old fellow buys it, has it for 30 or 40 years, and then sells it on.
Could this Benedetti have better relations with the church than Galileo had at the time? And could that account for the disparity?
It's possible. Certainly he never came under the same opprobrium. He never was reviled to the same extent. I have a feeling that he probably was treading carefully, as a lot of people were in those days, because I've been looking at marginalia by other scholars just to get a sense of the whole phenomenon. And certainly they will write things in the margins that you don't see them publishing in their books. Guido Baldo del Monte, he owned a copy of Benedetti, and it's heavily annotated. And he goes off on tangents and all sorts of directions that are not necessarily entirely respectful.
So they used the margins to sort of speculate, but they didn't publish them.
That's right, yes. And who knows, the marginalia, of course, if you're a professor, might also make it into your teaching curriculum. But that's another thorny issue. We know that people like Galileo had to teach one thing in their classes, and maybe they wrote something completely different. So we know Galileo had to teach a geocentric universe, an Earth-centered universe in the classroom, but was free to believe and write about other things. And this is quite well attested for various figures, not just for him. So you've got your public face and your private face, if you will.
I find much of your evidence to be very compelling, and it was very interesting detective story. Thanks. I did have one question about your statistics on the initials. Maybe I missed a step, but I wasn't sure. I mean, I got all the stuff you were doing with how it could be Galileo Galilei. But I wasn't completely convinced that it had to be a GG.
I've asked,
it could be a C, or it could be CG, or GC.
It could be indeed. That is not beyond the realm of possibility.
Or some other letter that just...
I've been looking very, you can imagine, I've been looking very careful at tiny little scraps. The C's are somewhat different in the way they do that top hook typically, but of course it varies from person to person a bit. And so I think that those are two G's, but I would be open to the possibility that they're not. I don't think there's a smoking gun there necessarily.
Yeah, I think some of the other evidence was more.
Yeah, but still then you have the question, why mutilate the book if it's somebody inoffensive? It's Charlie Chaplin. Who wants to excise the signature? And if it's just somebody harvesting a celebrity signature, why botch the job and not take the whole thing out?
Right.
Could you go back to the slide that has that? Because I missed that one.
Sure. Let's see. So both sides of the page there? Let's see. I think that's the one. This one? Is that the one? Let me blow it up a bit.
I have to look closer, I'm sorry. My legs are old.
It looks
Or I can
like
give you the
scissors.
later slides, which do show more detail, but only one at a time.
Wouldn't somebody way back when use a different way to cut it if it had been scissors? I mean, or a knife? I mean, they look so clean cut.
They do look very cleanly cut. But I'm sure people had sharp blades in those days, like barbers had razors, for instance. But yes, that is a good point. That's why I made a point of saying that if it appears in this bookseller's catalog that seems to be 19th century, it must be at least that old, the cut, and not something more modern.
What reason would you guess that somebody would have cut out whatever was written there?
Well, if it's his name, I guess you might not necessarily want your book to be associated with this unperson. This person who's been subjected to damnatio, obliteration of memory. I mean, I have circumstantial evidence for the fact that he was not very popular and people wanted to distance themselves from him, but I don't know to what extent that really impacted things on a daily basis. I mean, after all, who's going to go poking through your library unless you've got reason to think that, the church might suddenly come knocking at the door? But yes, it's a good question. It seems a little paranoid.
Would like a microanalysis of the cut help determine it?
Maybe. As I say, it has to be older than that bookseller's catalog, whenever that is. But yeah, I've wondered. I mean, so far, to be honest with you, I haven't spent a dime on this research project. Internet's free. And so having to actually spend real money, it's a sort of a psychological hurdle there. I'm a Scotsman after all. So, yeah, but maybe that would be the thing to do. Also, maybe analysis of the inks. But the paleographical evidence, according to the world expert, Isabella Trucci, does seem to suggest these annotations are all early 17th century Italian. I mean, she said to me twice in 2 different emails, there's no way it can be later. So, if she's happy with that, and she works with Galileo's manuscript, she would know, I guess, then I'm happy to take that as a given.
Have you presented this to any Galileo scholars yet?
No, I've just presented it, an earlier version of this paper in Windsor in April. There are a couple of people from the history department there, but nobody who was a real expert. I have, however, approached some Galileo scholars on my own by email. One of my professors at Princeton, Tony Grafton, he's well known in Renaissance studies, and he sent me on to other people who would also know things. That's how I came upon Isabella Trucci in Florence, for instance, by word of mouth. And so I have been asking around and sending people images like this one, and sending them copies of my ideas, just to see what they say. And so far, nobody has been willing to commit to what I've proposed here about the identity of the author of the inscriptions, of the annotations. But neither are they able to rule it out. So.
I was under the impression that the discovery of Jupiter's moons are one of the institutional Galileo things that he discovered. It seems that this kind of problematizes that, well, it seems to problematize lots of the institutional Galileo. But is there a chronological reason why it could not be that that Benedetti was influenced by Galileo's work?
Benedetti died in 1590, and Galileo didn't really write anything that early. I mean, his De Motu came out in 1590. And from what we know about Benedetti, he was pretty much holed up at Turin. You do have some of his correspondence. His circle of friends and acquaintances was not terribly great. He was a pretty private scholar, you could say. So I doubt that the two of them knew of each other in his lifetime.
I'm interested in the borrowings. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is it straight cut and paste plagiarism, or is it paraphrase?
It's the sort of thing that if I saw it in a student paper, I'd send it on to academic integrity. And it would be a judgment call, perhaps. Because, as I say, I've been looking at things like Sidereus Nuncius, actually looking at what the Latin says, looking for keywords and recurrences of phrases. And I haven't really found precise phrases being borrowed at all. I mean, inevitably you might have some overlap in words because there's only so many words to describe something. But the ideas certainly do seem, the sharing of ideas does seem to me to be a very real possibility because, for instance, Benedetti raises the possibility that the moon, the dark side of the moon shines a bit because Venus is reflecting, or is shining on it, and we see that reflected. And Galileo pouring scorn on this, Some people say that it could be Venus, but this is a load of malarkey. That suggests to me a sort of ad hominem, I know you. I'm addressing this to you and what you think, and those who think like you. But if it were, plagiarism, that's a bit of a sensationalist word. I hoped it would draw people in. But as I say, in the 17th century, maybe standards are quite different. I mean, it seems to me quite clear that you have a good deal of to and froing, people talking with each other, sharing notes, sharing letters a lot of the time, writing in margins and sharing books around with those marginalia. And so it's often quite hard, I think, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what exactly happened, but I think there's a good possibility of it.
If only it said Jesus had a wife, you could have been on the front page of the New York Times.
Do you know Professor
Moss?
Yes.
She came to Windsor a number of